Can the dead speak? And more importantly, if they did, would anyone listen? In Greenbrier County, West Virginia, in 1897, this wasn't just a campfire tale. It became the basis for a murder trial. The official report said that a young woman named ZONA HEASTER had simply died of an everlasting faint. But her mother knew the truth was far darker. She swore that her daughter's spirit returned from beyond the grave to name its own killer. They say a ghost can't testify in court. But in the old mountains of Appalachia, the veil between this world and the next is paper thin. Before the whispers and the shadows, there was just Greenbrier County, a place carved out of the Appalachian mountains where the hollows hold the morning mist like a secret and life moves with the rhythm of the seasons. It was a hard land, but an honest one. People here knew their neighbors, they knew the old stories, and they knew that some things in this world couldn't be explained by logic or law. This was the world of ZONA HEASTER, a young woman as vibrant and untamed as the mountains she called home. Locals just called her Zona. She was a beauty, with a spirit that refused to be broken. In a time when a woman's reputation was a fragile thing, Zona had already weathered a storm, having borne a child out of wedlock. But shame wasn't in her nature. She held her head high, her laughter echoing in the hills, a testament to a soul that craved life and love without condition. She was a daughter of these mountains, and she was looking for a future as bright as her own spirit. Then a stranger rode into town. His name was Erasmus Shue, but folks called him Trout. He was a blacksmith, strong and handsome, with a smooth way of talking that could charm a bird from a tree. He was new, a man without a past, or at least without one he was willing to share. When his eyes met Zona's, a spark ignited that was too powerful for either of them to ignore. He wasn't like the local boys. He spoke of a life beyond the confines of Greenbrier, a life filled with passion and promise. Their romance was a whirlwind, a sudden fire that burned hot and fast. Trout showered Zona with affection, painting a picture of a perfect life together. For a girl who had known hardship, his words were like a sweet melody, promising a home, a name, and a love that would protect her from the world's judgment. She was completely captivated, seeing in him not just a husband, but the fulfillment of all her dreams. But one person saw not a dream, but a nightmare. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, felt a chill every time Trout Shue was near. A mother's intuition is an ancient and powerful thing, and hers screamed that something was wrong. She saw a darkness behind his charming smile, a predator's stillness in his eyes. She warned Zona, begged her to be careful, but her daughter was blinded by the light of first love, deaf to the warnings of a woman who had learned to listen to the whispers of the mountains. In October of 1896, against her mother's wishes, Zona married Trout. They moved into a small house near the blacksmith shop, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed like Zona's dream had come true. She was Mrs. Shue, a wife with a home and a future. But the Appalachian winter was closing in, long and cold, and a darkness far deeper than the winter nights was gathering over that little house. The dream of a happy life, built so quickly, shattered just as fast. The Appalachian winter had settled deep into the bones of the mountains, but on January 23, 1897, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran through Greenbrier County. It had been only 3 months since the wedding. A young boy, sent by Trout Shue on an errand to his home, found a scene of shocking stillness. Zona was lying at the bottom of the stairs, lifeless. The boy ran, his feet pounding the frozen earth, his heart hammering against his ribs, carrying the terrible news back to town. By the time help arrived, led by the local doctor George Knapp, the scene was already changed. Trout Shue had carried his wife's body upstairs and laid her on their bed. He was wild with a grief that seemed too loud, too performative. He threw himself upon her, his sobs echoing through the small house, creating a wall of sound and sorrow that kept everyone at a distance. He was a man drowning in despair, or so it seemed. The doctor, faced with a hysterical husband and no obvious signs of a struggle, could only do so much. But as the community gathered to prepare for the funeral, Trout's behavior grew stranger, more controlling. Now, in those days, preparing a body for burial was a sacred ritual performed by family and female neighbors. It was a final act of care and respect. But Trout refused to let anyone touch his wife. He insisted on dressing Zona himself, a task he performed alone behind a closed door. When he was done, she was presented in her finest dress, a beautiful garment with one very peculiar feature, a high, stiff collar that reached all the way to her chin. As if the collar weren't enough, Trout then wrapped a large scarf around her neck, explaining tearfully that it had been her favorite. In the coffin, her head seemed oddly loose, and he propped it up with pillows on either side. Any time a mourner came close to pay their respects, to touch her hand or adjust the pillows, Trout would fly into a rage, his grief turning instantly to aggression. He hovered over the head of the coffin, weeping and wailing, physically shielding her neck from view. The whispers started then. People had seen grief before, but this was different. This felt like a man guarding a secret. Knapp, influenced by Trout's frantic behavior and the lack of an autopsy, recorded the official cause of death as an everlasting faint. He later amended it to complications from childbirth, trying to find a medical reason for such a sudden tragedy. With a doctor's signature on the certificate, there were no more questions to be asked, at least not by the law. ZONA HEASTER Shoe was buried in the local cemetery, her high collar and scarf intact. The cold earth covered the coffin, the case was closed, and a terrible secret was seemingly buried forever. For the town of Greenbrier, the story was over. A tragedy, yes, but a closed chapter. For Mary Jane Heaster, however, the real story was just beginning. In the dead quiet of her home, her daughter's absence was a deafening roar. Grief gnawed at her, but beneath it was a cold, hard certainty. Zona had not just died. She had been taken. Mary Jane prayed, not for comfort, but for truth. She begged for a sign, any sign, to prove what her heart already knew. And in the deep, silent nights of that Appalachian winter, her prayers were answered. It started with a cold. Not the kind that seeps in from a drafty window, but a cold that rose from the floorboards, a deathly chill that settled deep in her bones. For 4 nights in a row, the same thing happened. The room would grow frigid, and a faint light would begin to glow in the darkness, coalescing into the form of her daughter, Zona. She wasn't a terrifying specter, but a figure of profound sadness, her form shimmering like moonlight through mist, her eyes pleading. And then she spoke, her voice like the rustle of frozen leaves. The ghost of Zona told a story that made her mother's blood run cold. She spoke of Trout Shoe, not as the charming blacksmith the town knew, but as a man of sudden, violent tempers. On that final evening, his rage had ignited over something as simple as the evening meal. He had come home expecting meat for dinner, and when he found there was none, a storm broke inside their little house. It was an argument, like many couples have, but it was laced with a darkness that Zona had come to fear. Her daughter's spirit recounted the final horrifying moments. The argument escalated, and in a flash of fury, Trout grabbed her. The ghost didn't speak of a struggle, it spoke of a sudden, brutal finality. She told her mother that he had clamped his hands around her neck, his rage giving him an inhuman strength. Then came the part of the vision that would be seared into Mary Jane's mind forever. To show her mother exactly what had happened, the spirit of Zona slowly turned its head. It turned and turned, past the point where a living neck could go, all the way around, until a faint, dry snap echoed in the silent room. A sound that was the final punctuation mark on her daughter's life. The apparition explained everything. It explained why her head was so loose in the coffin, why Trout had propped it with pillows. It explained the high, stiff collar and the carefully placed scarf. They were all meant to hide the terrible truth of his hands. For 4 nights, the ghost returned, telling the same story, reinforcing the same horrible details, until Mary Jane was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a witness. She was the keeper of a testimony delivered from the other side of the veil, and she knew she could not stay silent. When the 4th night passed, and the ghost of her daughter did not return, a new kind of silence fell over Mary Jane Heaster's home. It was no longer the silence of grief, but the heavy silence of purpose. The story her daughter's spirit had shared was now a weight in her soul, a truth she had to carry out into the world of the living. She knew how it would sound. A woman, already half mad with sorrow, telling tales of a visitor from the grave. They would call her a fool, or worse, a liar. But the image of Zona's head turning, the ghostly echo of that final, terrible sound, it gave her a courage that no amount of ridicule could shake. With a resolve as hard as the frozen Appalachian ground, she went to the county prosecutor, John Alfred Preston. You can just imagine the scene. A man of law and logic, sitting behind a desk piled with earthly matters, suddenly confronted by a woman whose chief witness was a ghost. Preston listened, his expression unreadable, as Mary Jane recounted the 4 nights of visitations. She didn't flinch or falter, describing the icy cold, the shimmering light, and the horrifying story that came with it. On its face, the story was unbelievable, the kind of mountain folklore that had no place in a courtroom. But Preston was a thoughtful man, and he remembered the whispers that had followed Zona's funeral. He remembered the reports of Trout Shoe's bizarre, possessive grief. He remembered the high collar and the scarf. Mary Jane's tale, as wild as it was, provided a chilling explanation for all of it. It was a single strange key for a lock no one else could open. Her story wasn't just a vision, it was a theory of the crime that made perfect, terrible sense. Risking his career and his reputation, Preston made a decision. He would listen to the ghost. He went back to Dr. Knapp and, armed with Mary Jane's conviction, persuaded him that something was deeply wrong. An order was given for the exhumation of ZONA HEASTER Shoe. On February 22, 1897, a small group of men stood in the cold silence of the cemetery. The work was grim, the sound of shovels striking frozen earth a violation of the peace. They raised the coffin, and in a makeshift autopsy room, the truth was finally brought into the light. The high collar and scarf were removed, and there, on Zona's neck, was the proof. Bruises, shaped like fingerprints, were still visible on her skin. Dr. Knapp's examination was thorough this time. He found that her windpipe had been crushed, and then he felt her neck. The first and second vertebrae were dislocated. Her neck had been broken. Every single detail from the ghost's testimony was now cold, undeniable, physical fact. The whispers of a ghost had led them to the evidence. The law, which had been so quick to close the case, now moved with swift and terrible purpose. The charm and the tears of Erasmus Trout Shoe were now meaningless. He was no longer the tragic widower. He was the monster from his dead wife's story. The manhunt was short because the culprit had been hiding in plain sight all along. Trout Shoe was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. The trial of Trout Shoe became a sensation. Word of the Greenbrier ghost spread through the mountains like wildfire, drawing crowds to the courthouse in Lewisburg. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was a spectacle, a clash between the modern world of law and the ancient world of mountain belief. The courtroom was packed, a sea of faces, some hungry for justice, others just hungry for a good story. Prosecutor Preston had a strong case built on the solid scientific evidence of the autopsy. He had the broken neck, the crushed windpipe, the bruises. He had the facts. But he knew the heart of the story. The thing that had brought them all here was Mary Jane Heaster's spectral visitor. The defense attorney, on the other hand, saw Mary Jane as his greatest asset. He believed her story was so outlandish, so patently insane, that he could use it to discredit the entire investigation. He thought he could paint her as an unreliable, hysterical woman whose grief had pushed her into delusion. He planned to make a mockery of her testimony and, by extension, the entire prosecution. It was a fatal miscalculation. When Mary Jane took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. The defense attorney began his cross-examination, his tone dripping with condescension. He asked her about the ghost, expecting her to become flustered, to contradict herself, to crumble under the pressure of the court's scrutiny. He asked if the ghost's feet were bare. He asked what she was wearing. He asked if she spoke in a whisper. He was trying to catch her in a lie. But Mary Jane Heaster did not crumble. With an unshakable calm and a sincerity that was spellbinding, she answered every question. She looked directly at the jury, 12 men of the mountains who understood a world that wasn't always visible to the naked eye. She told them, under oath, about the 4 nights her daughter came to her. Her testimony was filled with the small, human details that make a story real. Her voice never wavered. She was not a madwoman. She was a mother, delivering a message. The attorney's strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of making her look foolish, he had given her the stage to tell her incredible story to the jury, who listened, captivated. Her testimony had a profound effect. While the ghost's testimony was not officially entered as evidence, it filled the courtroom with a truth that was more powerful than any legal document. It gave the cold, clinical facts of the autopsy a voice and a motive. It explained why a man would act so strangely at a funeral, why he would cover his wife's neck with such care. The jury looked at Trout Shue, sitting defiant and smirking at the defendant's table, and they saw him not just through the eyes of the law, but through the eyes of Zona's ghost. On July 11, 1897, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty. Erasmus Trout Shue was sentenced to life in prison. The law of man had delivered its justice, but everyone in that courtroom knew it had been guided by a justice from somewhere else entirely. Trout Shue, the charming blacksmith, was sent to the state penitentiary in Moundsville, where he died just 3 years later, taking whatever was left of his secrets with him to the grave. The slam of the prison gate on Trout Shue was not the end of this story. In fact, once he was safely behind bars, the truth he had hidden for so long began to seep out like poison from a wound. Investigators, prompted by the sensational trial, started digging into his past. It turned out Zona wasn't his first wife, or even his second. A dark, terrifying pattern began to emerge. His first wife had divorced him, citing extreme and brutal cruelty. His second wife had died just a year into their marriage under circumstances that now seemed chillingly familiar, a sudden, mysterious fall. The mountains had been sheltering a predator for years. The ghost of Zona Heaster hadn't just sought justice for herself. Her voice from the grave had unmasked a man who was likely a serial abuser and murderer, a man who had used his charm to lure women to their deaths, confident that the isolation of these hills would keep his secrets buried. His conviction wasn't just a victory for one family, it was a reckoning that had been a long time coming. Today, if you travel those winding West Virginia roads into Greenbrier County, you can still find the physical traces of this story. You can visit the Soul Chapel Methodist Cemetery, a quiet, humble place where Zona Heaster Shue is buried. Her tombstone stands as a silent testament to a life cut tragically short. For decades, it has been a pilgrimage site for those who know the story, a place to stand and wonder at the power of a mother's love and the thinness of the veil. But the most incredible piece of this story's legacy stands not in the cemetery, but alongside the road for all to see. It's a historical marker, the kind you see all over the country commemorating battles and births. But this one is different. Cast in metal for the state of West Virginia to acknowledge forever, the plaque reads, "Interred in a nearby cemetery is Zona Heaster Shue, Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband. An autopsy on the exhumed body verified the ghost's testimony. It ends with a sentence that still sends a shiver down the spine. The only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. The court records are filed away. The people who filled that courtroom are long gone, but the mountains remember. The story of the Greenbrier ghost has become woven into the very fabric of Appalachian folklore, a tale told around fires and on front porches. It serves as a permanent reminder that in this land of mist and shadow, some bonds are stronger than death, and some truths will find a way to be heard, even if they have to cross the threshold of the grave to do it. So we come back to the question we started with. Can the dead speak? And would we listen if they did? Skeptics will say that Mary Jane Heaster was a shrewd and desperate woman, that she cleverly took the town's whispers and her own suspicions and wove them into a ghost story, the only tool she had to force the hand of a legal system that had already dismissed her daughter's death. In a world where a woman's word meant little, perhaps the word of a ghost was the only testimony that could not be ignored. But whether you believe it was a spirit returned from the grave or the manifestation of a mother's unbreakable love, the truth that was unearthed is the same. This story isn't just about a ghost. It's about a voice that refused to be silenced. It's about the fierce, primal power of a mother's intuition in a world that often trusts only what it can see and touch. It teaches us that sometimes justice doesn't come from laws written in books, but from a truth that whispers from just beyond our understanding. The story of the Greenbrier ghost has become a permanent part of the American landscape because it speaks to a fundamental hope, that love is stronger than death, that evil will ultimately be exposed, and that even in the deepest silence, a cry for justice will find a way to be heard. It is a chilling, beautiful reminder that in the old mountains, some secrets refuse to stay buried.